Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. So, the Peterson-Zizek debate
duel of the century
has finally happened. It was pretty much exactly as I expected it to be. It had good moments, it even had some great moments, and it certainly had funny moments and interesting moments, but it wasn't really what we wanted, in my opinion. So I guess first I'm gonna give my general thoughts, then I'm gonna talk about some of Peterson's arguments which in my opinion were absolutely terrible, and give my general critique of what I think is the problem with Zizek, I guess. So basically Peterson makes these tired old anti-communist arguments, extremely cliché, what we've heard a million times before. It's all in there. Human nature, communism has killed millions, communism has never worked, calculation problem, it's all there. And, as expected, Zizek doesn't really tackle any of those, because that's just not his thing, he never does that. He never even defends the historical legacy of socialism. He just talks about entirely different things. Peterson seemed very unprepared. He was not familiar with Zizek's work, really. He tried to act like he knew about Zizek, but he clearly didn't, because he went into the debate saying that he studied the Communist Manifesto and he's gonna outline the problems in the Communist Manifesto, and then he attempts to do that, and I'm gonna talk about that in a little bit, but he failed miserably, absolutely miserably. And then he expected that Zizek would jump in trying to defend the historical legacy of Marxism or something, and then he's super surprised when Zizek doesn't do that, when Zizek just talks about different topics. And that just demonstrates how unfamiliar Peterson was with Zizek's work, or even Zizek's talks. I haven't read any of Zizek's books, but I've watched a good amount of his lectures. I know his views. So then Peterson continues to bash historical socialism, says Stalin was a catastrophe, Mao was a catastrophe, it was all a catastrophe, blah blah blah. Zizek doesn't really do anything to contest that, and then Peterson is surprised. That's pretty much it. Instead, what Zizek did do, instead of just attacking communism, he got Peterson to start talking about the problems with capitalism. Of course, Peterson doesn't think there's anything that can be done, really. He repeated over and over again that, yeah, there's problems, but there's nothing that can be better. He said that climate change is not as big of a problem as people think it is. There's always going to be inequality, but we're trying to deal with it to the best of our ability. Which is just, that's the typical moderate position that, yeah, it's not good, but this is the best we can do. Stop talking about any real change. And, yeah, only somebody who is well off can say, stop talking about radical changes. There's 3 billion people living in absolute destitution and massive poverty. Maybe we should do something. Maybe we should actually implement some real change. Just saying. Probably the best part of the debate was Zizek confronting Peterson about postmodern neo-Marxist in academia. Benji actually made a really good video about that. I'm gonna put that in the description.
Who are these postmodern egalitarian neo-Marxists, and where do you see any kind even of Marxism? I see in it mostly an impotent, an utterly impotent moralization. Please, I'm so sorry that I was too loud.
That's no problem.
And I mean, think about it. There's David Harvey, Zizek himself, Parenti, and half of these people are retired anyway. So it's pretty obvious that there is no great cabal of
the Jews,
postmodern neo-Marxists controlling everything, pulling all the strings. Peterson has to know that that's basically dog whistling to the neo-Nazis, the alt-right and the far-right who watch him, that emboldens them. Peterson has to know that it contributes to this entirely fallacious far-right narrative that, yeah, you have the Jewish cultural Marxists who are secretly in control, and they spread liberal values and homosexuality and multiculturalism and immigration and whatnot to destroy the white race or something. Marxists are progressive, but we're not liberals. Those are very different things. Liberals will say, vote for Hillary, even though she's a terrible imperialist, but because she's a woman, that means she's good. Well, a Marxist would never agree. A Marxist would say that Hillary is an absolute disgrace to the women's rights movement and women's liberation. A liberal would say that if the Israeli military allows gay people in it, then that means it's good. A Marxist would never agree. A Marxist would never agree that if it's a gay soldier killing Palestinian civilians, then that supposedly makes it good. That's what we call pink imperialism. This liberal pink-washing and pink imperialism is what capitalism uses to fool liberals into supporting capitalist imperialism. Same with immigration. Imperialist wars, capitalist free trade policies, those are what cause mass migration and refugees and whatnot. That's something that's caused by capitalism and something that Marxism entirely opposes and tries to oppose as actively as possible. But anyway, I think in the debate I managed to narrow in basically the fundamental core of Peterson's political argument, and it's even more simplistic than I originally imagined. I mean, people have all the lobster memes about the lobster hierarchies and whatnot, because Peterson always talks about hierarchies and how the one time he said that lobsters have hierarchies. The whole hierarchy argument is basically a variation or a new wording for the human nature argument. So here's how it goes.
This ancient problem of hierarchical structure is clearly not attributable to capitalism, because it existed long in human history before capitalism existed, and then it predated human history itself. So the question then arises, why would you necessarily, at least implicitly, link the class struggle with capitalism?
To me, it just seems like a really sneaky thing he's doing, but maybe he actually believes it. So he says that Marxism just looks at class struggle. Worker versus capitalist, slave versus slave owner. But Peterson thinks that it's more complicated than that. Alright, well, how so? Now he claims that Marxism is simplistic and he is more deep and profound because he adds complexity. But what kind of complexity does he actually add? Well, he says it's not class struggle, it's not worker versus capitalist, it's not slave versus slave owner. It's really hierarchical struggle between just anybody who is above or below in any hierarchy. No, that's actually absolutely meaningless. What does hierarchical struggle even mean? It means absolutely nothing. If I'm playing a game of soccer, I'm competing to be the best athlete in my team and I'm competing against the opposing team. That's hierarchical struggle. But is that the same kind of hierarchical struggle, or even in any way comparable to the type of struggle that is class struggle? No. It's totally apples and oranges. There's nothing even remotely similar. You can't compare them. In order for this hierarchical struggle argument to make sense, Peterson would have to demonstrate that this other type of struggle, that is not class struggle, is somehow more primary. But he can't do that. He tries, sort of, but he really fails. Marxism talks about class struggle because class struggle is primary. And then, in the modern era, a lot of Marxists consider that imperialism is the primary form of class struggle. So we look at that, but we always define what is the primary type of conflict. If I'm playing Quake Live or something, that's a type of struggle, but that's not significant. That's not the primary struggle of my life. That's not the primary struggle of my existence. Yes, there are all kinds of different hierarchies. There's hierarchies between me and my friends. Some of us are better looking, some of us are smarter, some of us are more articulate. Now, let's assume that you are black, or a woman, or gay, for example, or trans. Well, okay, in that circumstance, you will have a significant different type of hierarchical struggle. Okay, so if you're black, you face real oppression, racism. A Marxist would say that that is tied to class, it's tied to the capitalist, imperialist, neo-colonial system, it's tied to poverty, and certainly if you're not poor, then you can mitigate the racism. It doesn't really sharply impact you anymore if you are super rich. I would say that it's a different form of class struggle, but Peterson doesn't talk about anything like that. As if any kind of hierarchy or any kind of difference or any kind of struggle is equally significant, and therefore we shouldn't talk about class struggle. But that's just crazy. It's like if my middle school band doesn't win the middle school band project, then that's supposedly the same level of struggle or as significant as if I'm like a Palestinian child and I have to dodge Israeli bullets. Some struggle just is primary, and some struggle just is entirely secondary and not as meaningful, and doesn't matter. Class struggle is the defining struggle of our whole society, of our whole economic global system. This other type of stuff just isn't. Alright, so he then tries to demonstrate the primacy of hierarchical struggle instead of class struggle by saying that hierarchies have existed before capitalism. But once again, the same problem arises. What is hierarchy in this context? It's a meaningless term, as if all hierarchy is equally significant. Either Peterson is just ignorant of Marxism, which is probably the case, but I don't know if he's this ignorant, or if he's just hoping that his audience is. Marx does not deny that there are differences between people. If you read the critique of the Gotha program, he talks about how some people are physically stronger, some people will produce commodities faster, easier, better than others. So there is a natural inequality in people's capabilities, and that's just obvious. Somebody's more athletic, somebody's more articulate, there are these differences. But is that the primary contradiction and the primary conflict of our society? No. In a slave society, do you think the slaves are gonna be like, well, yeah, the slave owner is ruthlessly exploiting us, but then again, I think it's more significant that this other slave is better looking than me, so I think that's the primary contradiction of my life. No, the primary contradiction of their lives is obviously slavery. Then Peterson basically does the whole human nature argument. He says humans are naturally different, hence you have this natural hierarchy, therefore communism supposedly goes against human nature and is impossible, and capitalism supposedly corresponds to human nature. Tired old argument. But once again, he's ignorant about Marx. He doesn't know that Marx actually talks about natural differences in people, and that that's not a problem for communism. And it's just a foolish idea to think that capitalism perfectly corresponds to human nature. As if, and I've made this joke before, as if you let a feral child loose into the wild for like a year and then he's gonna build Walmart. No. Capitalism does not exist in nature. Capitalism doesn't exist in what Rousseau would call a state of nature. No, hunter-gatherer society exists in nature. Capitalism exists in civilization, in society. Insert "we live in a society" meme. In a state of nature, we had a hunter-gatherer society, what Marx called primitive communism, because that was a society where everybody worked, where there was no exploiter class, there were no different classes, there were no means of productions, there was no property. Land wasn't seen as property, there was no cattle, and therefore no cattle property. There were no machines, and therefore no machine property, no means of production as property. That is how humans lived for 250,000 years. 250,000 years. That is how humans lived in a state of nature. Then technology developed, we built civilization, we built society, and then instead of just having biological evolution, we started to have cultural evolution, societal evolution, technological evolution, what have you. And then we got these different forms of societies. We got slave society, feudal society, capitalist society, socialist society. Capitalism doesn't naturally grow out of a human's biology. It emerged as a result of previous civilizations, previous cultural, scientific, and economic development. And that's why if you put a human in a hunter-gatherer society, he's gonna act a whole lot different than if you put him in a slave society. A hunter-gatherer is gonna think that it's perfectly natural that land is not owned by anybody. He's gonna have a naturally communist consciousness when it comes to land ownership. Somebody in a slave society is gonna think that it's perfectly natural that we have slaves. Every society has always said that this is how it's supposed to be, this is what human nature is. But human nature is malleable, and it greatly varies based on what economic system you're in. And that's the basic Marxist argument. That it really is the class struggle that defines how we act. It defines how our entire society is structured. Different classes, entirely different society. Slaves, slave society. Workers, capitalist society. Hunter-gatherers, primitive communist society. just a couple more points. So Peterson says that Marx wants a dictatorship of the proletariat, and he never explains how that is going to come about or how the leaders of this are supposed to be selected.
When you do establish a dictator of the proletariat, to the degree that you can do that, which you actually can't because it's technically impossible and an absurd thing to consider to begin with, not least because of the problem of centralization, and you have to hypothesize that you can take away all the property of the capitalists, you can replace the capitalist class with a minority of proletariats. How they're going to be chosen isn't exactly clear in the Communist Manifesto, and centralize that and put decision-making power in the hands of a few people, the mechanisms without specifying the mechanisms by which you're going to choose them.
Now, I don't know if Peterson knows the difference between dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism and communism. I don't know if he thinks the dictatorship of the proletariat is going to continue to exist for all eternity, because actually it's supposed to wither away in full communism. But regardless, he's still wrong. Marx actually talks about how we should select our leaders for the dictatorship of the proletariat. He talks about that in the Civil War in France, and most people have probably seen it quoted in Lenin's State and Revolution. So if he had even read State and Revolution, which is pretty significant, it's a very influential and very famous book, and also a short book, so if he had even read that, he would already know that Marx looks at the Paris Commune and he says we should do something like that. The population of the Paris Commune gathered into a mass meeting, a Soviet of sorts, and they elected representatives to their leading body, which they called the Central Committee, and the radical ideas were that there would be a right of recall, meaning that if the population decides they don't like the leader anymore, they can have a new vote and remove them, and that these representatives are not supposed to get any great privileges. They're supposed to earn the same wage as an average person, an average worker. That's what Marx said we should do. Peterson says that Marx acted like capitalists don't do anything useful, that when capitalists act as organizers of production, when they act as directors and managers, that supposedly that's useless and we can just ignore it.
Unless you assume, as Marx did, that all of the evil was with the capitalists and all the good was with the proletariats, and that nothing that capitalists did constituted valid labor, which is another thing that Marx assumed, which is palpably absurd. And the notion that you're adding no productive value as a manager rather than a capitalist it's absolutely absurd.
That's entirely false. Marxists all agree that we need somebody to direct production. We need somebody to organize production, and there's nothing wrong with that.
To produce engineers and technicians for the new society, training was expanded. And the communists said women should have equality with men, with equal pay. Ella Shistya was one of a new generation of women.
When
Lenin said that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, I decided that I should become an electrical engineer, that was my holy duty. And I didn't want to just draw up plans, I wanted to build an electric power station. That was my mission, and I achieved it. The revolution gave me the right to feel equal to any man. It gave me the right to work, to study what I wanted to study.
If somebody is the head of the company, meaning that he organizes everything, then that's actual legitimate work. That's important. Somebody has to do that. Even if we don't do it exactly like that, there still has to be some kind of mechanism for organizing work. So organizing work is actual legitimate labor. But the problem is, the capitalist is not just an organizer of work. You can have an organizer of work who is not a capitalist, and you can have a capitalist who is not an organizer of work. Those two things are entirely separate categories. We don't have a problem with organizers, we have a problem with capitalists. If the capitalist wants to stop being a capitalist and just start being an organizer of work, then that's totally fine with us. We don't have a problem with that. We just want him to stop exploiting other people's work. So once again, I don't know if Peterson is truly ignorant or if he's just making strawman arguments. Peterson also claims that, according to Marx, we supposedly can't make any profit. This is false.
The next problem is the criticism of profit. It's like, well, what's wrong with profit exactly? What's the problem with profit? Well, the idea from the Marxist perspective was that profit was theft. Well, how can you grow if you don't have a profit?
He's basically just confusing different definitions of profit. Marx considered that if a capitalist makes money off of the labor of his workers, that's exploitation. And that type of profit based on exploitation, Marx called surplus value. However, Marx still recognized, once again if you read the critique of the Gotha program, that of course a society needs to produce a surplus, enough to not only feed ourselves, repair machines, keep production going, but also take care of the sick, and to expand production. If I need 100 kilograms of potatoes to sustain myself for a period of time, in that time I can probably produce more than 100 kilograms of potatoes. There's no exploitation there. It would be exploitation if I paid you 10 cents an hour and you produced a value of $10 per hour. And then I would pocket the $9.90 and give you 10 cents, even though you're the only one working. That would be exploitation. Very different. Peterson is either deliberately making a strawman argument, or he just doesn't understand Marxist terminology and what profit is in classical economics. Lastly, he says that Marx believed that a communist society would somehow magically become more productive than a capitalist society. Since that didn't happen, then something bad. And this is once again entirely false.
The next theory is that somehow the proletariat dictatorship would become magically hyper-productive. And there's actually no theory at all about how that's going to happen.
The more exact Marxist argument is not that communist society is magically just better. Capitalism eventually becomes a hindrance to the growth of the productive forces. Productive forces are machines, factories, resources, stuff we use to produce, and also labor, and labor productivity. Capitalism constantly runs into crises because it has overproduction, bankruptcy, and financial crisis, and all these things. They keep stagnating the system every 10 or so years and collapsing the whole system and squandering untold amounts of resources and untold labor hours, and capitalism also has a constant unemployment. So there's all this squandered potential and all these wasted resources, and Marx argued that with socialism you don't need to have these crises, you can have full employment, you don't have to do things based on mindless accumulation of profit, you can actually do things based on rational plans. You don't have to compete and try to sabotage your rivals on the market. Instead, you can collaborate, you can pool all your resources together, and you will have a much faster growth of the productive forces. And you can actually observe that if you look at the Soviet Union, for example. When the Soviet Union launched the 5-year plans, they had the fastest economic growth in the world, because before they had these small private land holdings, these small private farms, which were not very effective. 10% of the private farms, the kulak farms, produced half the marketable grain. And 90% of the farms were so inefficient, so backward technologically, and so small that they barely produced anything. In the collectivization of agriculture, when they pooled all these resources together into bigger farms, collective farms, and they provided them with tractors and combine harvesters and machines from these state-owned machine and tractor stations, obviously they had better results, they had better growth. It was a better use of resources. When you replace tiny, technologically backwards farms with large-scale modern farms with modern farming techniques and farming equipment. Same with industry. And when it comes to crises, the Soviet Union had more than half a century of uninterrupted economic growth. From the end of the Second World War to Gorbachev, they had uninterrupted economic growth. Even if the growth was slower under Brezhnev and Andropov than it was with Stalin, it was still always growth. Growth. Despite all the problems, despite all the imperfections and flaws and whatnot, it was more effective. That's Marx's argument. Now, we could talk about why the Soviets implemented the types of misguided and erroneous policies that they did in the later period of the Soviet Union, but that's not really gonna fit in the scope of this video. Now, finally, my basic problem with Zizek is twofold. Firstly, he doesn't defend the historical legacy of socialism, and I don't mean that you have to defend it mindlessly or uncritically or as a whole, because obviously there's problems. You need to point out the problems and then point out the good things. But he just doesn't even try. He's like, yeah, it was bad, whatever, nothing to be learned from it. And most of the things he says are just factually not correct. They're just factually incorrect. And second of all, this was also pointed out by Jordan Peterson, is that Zizek doesn't provide any solutions. He criticizes. Sometimes his criticisms are interesting and sometimes very insightful, but he provides no solutions. He doesn't have an adequate understanding or an adequate explanation or critique of the past. He just throws it out as a whole, and he doesn't put forward any kind of program for what we should do now. To his credit, he doesn't claim to either. Zizek is of the pessimistic viewpoint that we are headed towards a collapse, and we don't know what to do, and we have to figure out what to do. That's his position. And how much can you really get out of that? I would argue that people have already put forward solutions that we could look at. If you look at the Marxist-Leninist community as a whole, there's a whole literature analyzing the problems of the old Soviet system based on actual facts. Zizek doesn't do that. And the Marxist-Leninist movement has also put forward many policies of what we're going to do now, moving forward. And I don't pretend that they are perfect, but at least we are putting forward a program. There's variations depending on the author, depending on the party and whatnot, depending on the country, as there should be, but there's also basic commonalities, and we've all looked at the problems with the previous types of socialism, and we all want to move forward and not repeat the mistakes of the past. We want to learn from the mistakes and successes of the past, not repeat the mistakes while building on the successes. Thank you very much for watching. Please like the video and subscribe. All of my social media links are in the description, as well as a link to my Patreon. See you next time, comrades.